On the cold, clear night of November 27th, 1928, under a full moon just 2 days before Thanksgiving, 3 men stood over a body in a secluded Pennsylvania valley. The man on the floor was Nelson Rehmeyer, a potato farmer, a father, and, in the terrified minds of his killers, a powerful witch who had cursed them. They had beaten him, kicked him, and strangled him with a rope. Now, in a final, desperate act to erase the man and the crime, they decided to burn the evidence. One of them spoke, his voice trembling in the sudden quiet of the old farmhouse.
"We have to burn it. Everything."
They doused his body in kerosene from a lamp, piled furniture and flammable materials on top, and struck a match. Flames erupted, and the men fled into the darkness, believing their secret was safe in the impending inferno, and that the curse that had plagued their lives was finally, violently, broken. But the fire didn't do what it was supposed to do. It didn't roar through the old wooden structure, consuming it until nothing but ash remained. Instead, it smoldered, and, for reasons no one could ever quite agree on, eventually died out on its own. When authorities arrived on Thanksgiving morning, 2 days later, they weren't met with the smoldering ruins of a farmhouse. They found the building still standing, heavy with the smell of soot and kerosene. Inside, they found the charred but largely intact body of Nelson Rehmeyer, and beneath him, burned deep into the floorboards, was an eerie, man-shaped scorch mark that would fuel dark speculation for decades to come. This is the story of the Hex Hollow Murder, a case where modern 20th century justice collided with an ancient belief system, and a crime that left behind a mystery that feels just as unsettling today. To understand how 3 men could be driven to murder over a hex, you have to understand the world they inhabited. This wasn't Salem in the 1690s. This was York County, Pennsylvania in the 1920s. But in the rolling hills and isolated hollows of what was known as the Hex Belt, old traditions from the Old World died hard. This was the heartland of the Pennsylvania Dutch, descendants of German-speaking settlers who brought with them a vibrant and deeply held folk culture. They were farmers and laborers, devoutly Christian, but their faith was intricately woven with a complex system of folk traditions that the outside world struggled to grasp. In their dialect, this system was called Braucherei, but most English speakers knew it by a borrowed and misleading term, powwowing. It had no connection to Native American practices. It was a unique blend of Christian prayers, herbal remedies, and ritualistic gestures passed down through generations. A powwower could be a respected neighbor you'd turn to for help healing a sickness in your family or livestock, or for ensuring a bountiful harvest. Many of their rituals came from a specific book, a kind of folk grimoire called Powwows, or the long-lost friend, first published in German by John George Homan in 1820. This book was a staple in many Pennsylvania Dutch homes, filled with charms, talismans, and prayers for almost any problem imaginable, from curing a toothache to protecting against robbers or evil spirits. Legend even held that simply carrying the book offered a degree of protection. But this power, the power to heal and protect, had a dark side. A practitioner who could heal was also believed to possess the power to harm. The same spiritual energy used for good could be twisted into malicious witchcraft, what they called hexery. A sudden illness, a failing crop, a string of devastating bad luck. These weren't always seen as random misfortune. They could be the work of a hex, a curse deliberately placed on you by an enemy. This created a world of simmering suspicion and fear. The same person who might have cured your child's fever could also be the one you'd blame if a cow mysteriously died or your barn caught fire. This was the world Nelson Rehmeyer lived in. Born in 1868 into a family that had first settled the area in the 1840s, he was a potato farmer in a remote hollow that bore his family's name. He was a large, imposing man, standing over 6 feet tall, and by 1928, at the age of 60, he was living as a recluse after separating from his wife. He was known in the community as a kind, if quiet man, but also as a powwow doctor. He practiced the healing arts, what some might call white magic, and people sought him out for his remedies. He was respected, but like all powwowers, he was viewed with a degree of caution. No one knew it yet, but this reputation as a man who could command unseen forces would ultimately become his death sentence. The man who would orchestrate that death sentence was John Blymire. Born in 1895, Blymire was a product of the very culture that would later consume him. His father and grandfather were both said to be skilled powwowers, but that gift seemed to have skipped a generation with John. His life, by all accounts, was a catalog of failures and misfortunes. The years leading up to 1928 were especially cruel. He struggled to hold a steady job, working sporadically in a cigar factory. His marriage to his wife, Lily, crumbled after 2 of their 3 children died in infancy. All the while, Blymire was plagued by his own failing health, suffering from constant headaches and a wasting sickness that left him weak, anxious, and weighing less than 100 pounds. In the world of a Pennsylvania Dutch powwower, this wasn't just a string of bad luck. It was a clear and terrifying pattern. It was a curse. Convinced he was hexed, Blymire began a desperate, years-long quest for a cure, consulting more than 20 different healers, spending all his money on them. They all agreed he was cursed, but none could break the spell. His obsession deepened, and his mental state frayed. At one point, he was evaluated as a borderline psychoneurotic and committed to a state mental hospital in Harrisburg, but his belief was stronger than any diagnosis. After just 48 days, he simply walked off the hospital grounds and made his way back to York, his conviction unshaken. The turning point came when Blymire visited a formidable witch in Marietta known as Emma Knopp, more famously remembered by the fictional name Nellie Knoll. Knoll, known as the River Witch of Marietta, had a powerful reputation. Over a series of expensive consultations, Knoll confirmed Blymire's worst fears. A powerful hex was the cause of all his suffering. And then, she gave him a name. "The one who has cursed you," she claimed, "is Nelson Rehmeyer." At first, Blymire refused to believe it. He had known Rehmeyer his whole life. In fact, Rehmeyer had supposedly used powwowing to cure Blymire of an illness when he was just a child, and had later employed him as a boy to dig potatoes. But Blymire was desperate, and Knoll was convincing. She then offered him what he would later claim was the final, bizarre proof he needed. According to Blymire's story, Knoll had him stare at a dollar bill in his hand until the face of George Washington dissolved and reformed into the face of Nelson Rehmeyer. For Blymire, whose mind was already teetering on the edge, this was irrefutable confirmation. Knoll then gave him the ritual to break the curse. The instructions were specific. He had to get a lock of Rehmeyer's hair and his personal copy of the long-lost friend. Both items had to be buried 6 to 8 feet underground. Realizing he couldn't overpower the imposing Rehmeyer alone, Blymire sought help. He found it at the cigar factory, drawing 2 teenagers into his paranoid quest. 18-year-old Wilbert Hess, a farmhand whose family also believed they were hexed after a string of misfortunes, and 14-year-old John Curry, a relative of Hess from a troubled home who idolized Blymire. United by a shared, terrifying delusion, the trio prepared to confront the man they believed was a witch. The night of November 27, 1928 was dark and moonlit over York County. Armed with about 25 feet of rope, John Blymire, Wilbert Hess, and John Curry made their way to Nelson Rehmeyer's isolated farmhouse. This wasn't planned as a murder. Their goal, etched into their minds by superstition and fear, was clear. Get the book and a lock of hair, just as the River Witch had instructed. There are accounts that Blymire and Curry had actually visited Rehmeyer the night before. They spent a seemingly peaceful evening with the older man, sharing stories and talking about powwowing before leaving, realizing they would need more force to subdue the large farmer. But on this night, they were committed. They tricked Rehmeyer into letting them into his home. Once inside, the demand was made.
Give us your book!
Blymire said, according to trial testimony. When Rehmeyer refused, the house exploded into violence. The three of them, one driven by years of obsession, two by youthful fear, lunged at the 60-year-old man. A fierce struggle broke out. Blymire attempted to choke Rehmeyer while Curry grabbed a piece of firewood and smashed it against Rehmeyer's head. Despite his age, Rehmeyer fought back with surprising strength, but he was outnumbered 3-1. The men beat and kicked him relentlessly, finally getting a rope around his neck and strangling him to death. After a few minutes of brutal, frantic chaos, Nelson Rehmeyer lay dead on his own floor. At his trial, Blymire would claim the final blow was struck at exactly 12:01 a.m., a detail that became a cornerstone of the burgeoning legend. In that moment, Blymire said he felt an immediate, profound sense of relief.
If he's dead, the hex is done.
Now, with a body at their feet, panic set in. The trio frantically ransacked the farmhouse, but they could not find Rehmeyer's copy of The Long-Lost Friend. To cover their tracks and create a false motive, they decided to stage the scene as a robbery, stealing the few dollars they could find in a pocketbook and dresser. Then, they made their final, fateful decision. They would burn the house to the ground. They dragged Rehmeyer's body to the center of the room, doused it with kerosene from a lamp, and piled flammable materials on top. They lit a match, and as flames began to lick at the body, they fled into the night, leaving the Hex House to its fate. For 2 days, the secret of what happened in Hex Hollow was held within the smoke-stained walls of the farmhouse. It was only on Thanksgiving morning, November 29th, that a neighbor grew concerned. He noticed that Nelson Rehmeyer's animals hadn't been fed, a highly unusual oversight for the farmer, and their cries grew louder. Upon investigating, he wasn't met with a collapsed, ashen ruin, but with a house that was still standing, thick with the acrid smell of smoke and kerosene. What he found inside was shocking. The fire hadn't raged through the old wooden structure as expected. Instead, it seemed to have smoldered intensely in one spot before, for some reason, dying out. And there, in the middle of the kitchen, lay Nelson Rehmeyer's body. He was badly charred, in some places down to the bone, but he was far from destroyed. The intense, localized fire had burned a large hole through the floorboards beneath him, and his body had fallen partially through, where it was caught by a potato bin hanging in the basement. Investigators theorized that this fall may have limited the fire's oxygen supply, saving the rest of the house from going up in flames. But for the superstitious locals, there was a much simpler and much more chilling explanation. Rehmeyer's own powwowing powers had worked one last time, refusing to let the fire destroy him or his home. The very survival of the Hex House was seen as irrefutable proof of the supernatural forces at play, transforming a brutal murder into a ghostly legend. Adding to the unsettling scene was the burn mark on the floor. Where Rehmeyer's body had lain, the fire had seared an eerie, man-shaped outline into the wood. While perhaps not the perfect carbon copy of later tall tales, the image was uncanny enough to become the central, haunting icon of the murder. For those who believed, this scorch mark, along with stories of a clock that supposedly stopped at 12:01, the alleged moment of death, was physical proof that something far more than a simple murder had occurred in Hex Hollow. This bizarre crime scene would soon capture the attention of the entire nation, putting not just 3 men on trial, but an entire belief system. If you're finding this deep dive into one of history's strangest cases compelling, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. The investigation into Nelson Rehmeyer's death was swift. Rehmeyer's estranged wife, Alice, told police that Blymire and Curry had come to her house asking for directions to her husband's isolated farm right before his death, giving them an immediate lead. Authorities quickly rounded up the suspects, who didn't need to be pressed hard. John Blymire and his young accomplices readily confessed to everything. They were not apologetic. In Blymire's mind, he hadn't committed a murder. He had performed a necessary, righteous exorcism. To the police, he plainly stated,
"I killed him. He had me hexed."
As news of the motive spread, the case became a national media sensation. Journalists from across the country descended on quiet, rural York, Pennsylvania. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about the York Hex Slayers, and the trial, which began in January 1929, was framed as a clash between the modern 20th century and a world of dark medieval superstition. The Philadelphia Record called it the weirdest and most curiously fascinating in the history of modern jurisprudence. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Amos W. Herman, tried to argue this was a simple murder for robbery, attempting to keep the word witchcraft out of the proceedings entirely. But the defense, led by Blymire's pro bono lawyer Herbert Cohen, insisted the motive was a deeply ingrained, sincere belief in witchcraft. They portrayed Blymire not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man driven mad by a cultural delusion with the mind of a ghost-haunted child. Ultimately, a formal insanity defense was not pursued, leaving the jury to decide a difficult question. Could a sincere belief, no matter how strange, excuse a murder? The jury didn't think so. John Blymire and 14-year-old John Curry were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Wilbert Hess, who was seen as more of a follower, received a lesser sentence for second-degree murder of 10 to 20 years. But in a strange epilogue to the violent crime, all 3 men were eventually paroled. Hess was released after 10 years. Curry was paroled in 1934 and went on to serve as a cartographer on General Eisenhower's staff during World War II, helping to draft maps for the invasion of Normandy. He later became a noted local artist. John Blymire, the ringleader, was finally released in 1953 after serving 23 years. He returned to York, got a job as a janitor, and lived a quiet life until his death in 1972. Blymire himself always maintained that the moment Rehmeyer died, his lifelong streak of bad luck ended and his health returned. "The witch is dead," he reportedly said after his conviction. "I can eat and sleep in peace now." The Hex Hollow murder sent a shockwave through the Pennsylvania Dutch community. The sensational trial branded powwowing not as a harmless folk remedy, but as a dangerous and backward superstition. The practice, once a common and accepted part of rural life, quickly declined, driven further into the shadows. The brutal killing of Nelson Rehmeyer had effectively put an entire belief system on trial, and in the court of public opinion, it was found guilty. The site of the murder became a place of dark legend. The area, once known as Rehmeyer's Hollow, was unofficially and permanently renamed Hex Hollow. Today, the hollow is part of the more pleasantly named Spring Valley County Park, but the house itself still stands. It remains private property, meticulously restored by one of Rehmeyer's great-grandsons, Ricky Ebaugh, who began opening the home for tours to tell the true story of his ancestor. Over the decades, the house has become a destination for paranormal enthusiasts and dark tourists, drawn by its grim and bizarre history. For years, visitors have told stories of strange phenomena, of shadowy figures, unexplained noises, doors opening on their own, and a lingering feeling of deep unease. The legend is perpetually kept alive by the two most powerful symbols of the crime: the story of a clock stopped at the moment of death, and the ghastly, man-shaped burn that remains seared into the original floorboards, a permanent scar from that violent night. The story of the Hex Hollow Murder is a chilling tapestry woven from faith, fear, and utter desperation. It's the story of John Blymire, a man so convinced he was the victim of a supernatural attack that he became a killer. And it's the story of Nelson Rehmeyer, a folk healer whose reputation for power seemed to follow him, even in death, defying the very flames that sought to erase him. The murder trials provided legal answers, sentencing 3 men for their crime. But the questions that linger are the ones that law and logic can't easily resolve. Why didn't the house burn down? Was it a simple accident of physics, damp wood, the way the body fell through the floor, limiting the oxygen supply? Or was it, as the legends have insisted for nearly a century, the final, unknowable act of a powerful powwower, his spirit rebuking the fire? The lines between sincere faith, cultural superstition, and mental illness are often perilously thin. John Blymire believed a hex was systematically destroying his life, and in his violent attempt to break it, he destroyed several others, including his own. The question that still echoes from the dark woods of Hex Hollow is this: while his methods were monstrous, was his belief that he was under attack entirely a delusion? What are your theories? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.